The generation that suffered and persevered through America's Great Depression and went on to fight World War II has been called America's greatest generation. The common theme of those living at that time seems to be self-sacrifice. Families working together as teams, marriages bound by deep commitment. 5 characteristics that made that generation worthy of greatness were demonstrated by a couple living in Stevens County. Chester and Lorraine Marty were role models of these traits. They took personal responsibility for their lives. They lived with humility and dignity. They had a tremendous work ethic. Work wasn't an option, it was the means to survive. They built and saved for the future. They remained faithful to their commitments. In other words, they did what they had to do in an honorable and dignified way. Both Lorraine and Chester were descendants of early immigrants to Stevens County. Chester's great-grandparents, Franz and Frena Marty, arrived in 1873 from Switzerland. Settling first in Carver County, Minnesota, by 1878 they were homesteading 160 acres in Baker Township of Stevens County. They planted 10 acres of trees on the prairie, which became known as Marty's Grove. Bernard Marty, one of the sons, grew up in Stevens County and met and married Emma Anderson in 1898. Emma's family were immigrants from Sweden who came in 1887 to Pepperton Township. Chester Emil Marty, the youngest of their children, was born on January 13, 1916. The family lived on the edge of Chickayo on 20 acres and owned and operated Marty Meats on Main Street. When Chester was only 7 months old, his father died at the age of 47 from a ruptured appendix. Now Emma was a widow, with 8 children 7 months to 17 years. She and her family worked together as a team for the next 17 years, and when all the children were raised, she married Joseph Cayley. Chester, now 17 and a senior in high school, made the decision to leave his high school prankster role behind. How was he named the prankster? The senior rouser of the Chickayo School in 1930 published a couple of Chester's pranks. They claimed that Chester put his own cigarette butts in the first-grade teacher's desk and reported to the principal that she was smoking. Miss Eddy asked Chester in science class, "Chester, name a liquid that won't freeze." Chester answered, "The hot water I get into?" Now he was thinking responsibly. He became aware of a program that he was eligible for, the Civilian Conservation Corps.
The United States elected a new president, eager to believe in his ability to lead, eager to believe in what he called the New Deal.
Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously.
One of the solutions President Franklin Delano Roosevelt proposed became the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. Young men from families where no one else had a job would be hired by the government to work on conservation projects. In the words of a recruiting poster, the CCC was a young man's opportunity.
3 million young men participated in this program in the nation. Chester moved to northern Minnesota, where his camp was working on clearing forest for roads and hanging telephone lines. They lived in tents, earning $30 per month, but were expected to send $25 back home as part of the program. The CCC camps were temporary communities unto themselves. In Minnesota, there were 12,200 men in 61 camps. Nationwide, 3 billion trees were planted and 800 parks were constructed. Lorraine's father, Fred Anderson, was born in 1895 to Richard and Olena Matheson Anderson. At 22, he was working in Montana when the U.S. entered World War I. He returned home and enlisted in the Army in 1917, serving in France until the war ended in 1918. Her mother was Sylvia Boldenow, of German ancestry, and at the age of 3 had settled with her family near Artichoke Lake in 1904. Fred and Sylvia met and married in 1922. There was a 6-year difference in their ages. Firstborn child Lorraine Florine Anderson was born February 26, 1923. She was delivered at home by a midwife in Stevens Township. These were hard times for farming, and the family of 3 moved to the Twin Cities of Minnesota, where Fred was a streetcar conductor for a short time. But missing family and friends and the way of life where they could be self-sufficient, they returned to a farm south of Chickayo. Diversified farming provided all that they needed along with a large garden, and they had plenty to do. Lorraine attended country school at District 48 through 8th grade. Her father died at the age of 41, when Lorraine was only 13, leaving Sylvia a widow at 35, with 5 children, ages 4 through 13. Not able to farm alone, the family moved to town and Lorraine attended Chickayo High School. She was smart, well-read, and graduated in 1941 as the class valedictorian, an inspiration to her future daughters, 2 of whom became nurses and 3 of whom became teachers. After graduation, Lorraine went to work at the local Red Owl grocery in Chickayo. Though 7 years separated Lorraine and Chester, they met, fell in love, and were married at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Chickayo on May 11, 1942. Their attendants were Eloise Boldenow, her aunt, and Joe McNally. They made a very smart and dapper wedding party. The women were in powder blue ensembles and the men in teal blue dress suits. Their first home was in Baudette, Minnesota, located in the north close to where Chester had worked at the CCC camp. He was now working for the REA, Rural Electric Association. Those 20 Marty acres on the edge of Chickayo drew them back to Stevens County, where they began farming with rented acres. Alan was born in June 1943, then Sandra, November 1944, and Janice was on the way, born in 1945, when Chester left for the Twin Cities. Here he worked at a defense plant making equipment and supplies for the military. He had lost an eye in an accident when only 3 years old and suffered serious injuries in a car accident in 1938. These 2 health issues kept him from active duty in the war, so he served in this way. The couple did what they had to survive and thrive. Whenever income in farming wasn't sufficient, Chester found ways to supplement. He worked for a short time in 1947 on the Garrison Dam project in North Dakota. 5 other men from the area went along for this job opportunity. On the farm, as more acres were acquired, they experimented with newer machinery. When he purchased the combine, another way to earn additional cash presented itself. Moving across the country from Kansas and working his way back north, he did custom combining. Lorraine, in her quiet, peaceful, and determined way, secured the home life for the family. She did all of the inside chores, plus the milking and caring for the hogs when Chester was gone or in the field. As she always had several youngsters to take care of, she would build a playpen out of the bales, stacked 2 high, and put the kids in there for safekeeping. The farm grew, and so did the family. After Alan, Sandra, and Janice, Karen was born in 1947. A tragic farm accident took her life at 16 months of age, 1 month before Thomas was born in 1948. A year later, Renee was born in 1949, Marcia in 1951, Gail in 1953, and Keith in 1956. 1948 proved to be an unbearable blow for the family. Along with the loss of toddler Karen, the 3 oldest children contracted the dreaded disease polio. Alan, Sandra, and Janice, who were 5, 4, and 3, were sent to the Sister Kenny Institute in Minneapolis for 3 to 4 months of treatment. Chester and Lorraine were able to visit on occasion, but couldn't even come into the room during the first weeks. The youngest, Janice, needed the aid of the iron lung. Sandra remembers seeing her little sister in the iron lung, and the rest of them were in cribs all along 4 walls. Therapy included exercise, dipping their arms in warm wax, letting it cool, and then peeling it off. Sister Elizabeth Kenny was an Australian nurse who treated the sick for 31 years in the outback. The title sister is not of a nun, but an honor title in British countries for a nurse of a certain rank. In 1911, she encountered her first polio case, and with no awareness of conventional practices being done elsewhere that immobilized affected limbs with braces and splints, she used her own common sense and understanding of the anatomy for treatment. She applied hot packs to loosen muscles and enable limbs to be moved, stretched, and strengthened. In 1940, believing this method held greater hope for those struck with the disease, she traveled to the United States. Approaching doctors on both the West and the East Coast, she was dismissed as a female and untrained, until she arrived at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. There, one of the doctors listened, learned, and challenged her to show him her methods. He called his colleagues at the University of Minnesota, where in 1942 the Sister Kenny Institute was established in Minneapolis. Sister Kenny's methods were the beginning of modern physical therapy as practiced today. By 1955, the Salk vaccine was available and immunization against polio began in earnest. The Sister Kenny Institute merged with Abbott Northwestern Hospital in Minneapolis in 1975, and it remains an active part of rehabilitation technologies. The practices of the Sister Kenny Institute were only established for 6 years in Minnesota at the time the Marty children were struck. When the family was all back home after their ordeal, the 50s and 60s passed very quickly. Small children's activities of pony rides, outdoor forts, and making mud pies changed to learning how to do the chores and methods of living off the land. The family picked rock, hauled grain, learned to butcher, can, and garden. Not the first family to get a TV, they entertained themselves with a rousing listen to Sunday afternoon radio and the Lone Ranger. One day Chester announced that they were getting a television. When the delivery truck came, it delivered a clothes dryer. The dryer had a glass panel on the front door. The children admit that they did watch the clothes tumble around, and around, and around in the window. In 1974, the Martys built a new split-level home in the country. 2 years later, Chester retired from farming, and the couple began an enthusiastic run of traveling to other places. In the past, they satisfied themselves with afternoon trips to the fishing lake, rainy week trips to camp at Cass Lake up north, or to hunt deer and fish. Now the destinations were named Glacier National Park, Alaska, Teton National Park, Norway, Ireland, and Hawaii. When Chester passed away at the age of 65 in 1981, the Marty families were busy with their own careers and in creating the next generations. Lorraine put her heart and soul into showing those generations the value of a grandparent. As she was 7 years younger than Chester, she spent the next 24 years alone in a new phase of life. She read, gardened, enjoyed needlework like quilting and hardanger. Hardanger is a needlework method that comes from Norwegian folk culture. She traveled to destinations where one of her daughters, Marcia, lived: Norway, West Africa, and Louisiana. There were weddings and baptisms to attend and family reunions of this growing family to enjoy. A home was purchased in town, in Chicago, where she was close to the many activities she supported. Her Extension Homemaker Club, the American Legion Auxiliary, and many activities at the Our Savior's Lutheran Church. Sadly, the complication of Alzheimer's disease affected her later years until this gentle and courageous woman passed away February 2nd, 2005. One of Chester's last comments to his daughter Sandra was, "We've had a good life." And they had. They stayed committed, role-modeled personal responsibility, built and saved. They lived their lives with dignity and respect. The farm that began with a few rented acres had grown to 720 owned and 400 rented acres when they retired. They started as a couple and had a family of 9 children, 23 grandchildren, 41 great-grandchildren, and 1 great-great-grandchild as of 2014. All of the children had learned the greatest generation's values and traits through the examples and teaching of their parents. They were applying them to their own busy and successful lives, creating the groundwork for all the greatest generations to come.
They built up this nation. There was food on the table. There were jobs on the farms and factories. The greatest generation did what they had to do. The greatest generation did it all for me and you. What's happened to our country? Now we're so divided. Our flag has both red and blue, so we should be united. We keep pointing fingers, laying blame at our neighbor's door. We all know the answer ain't love worth fighting for. Yeah, the greatest generation is what we've got to be. Yeah, the greatest generation should be you and me. Let's take a look inside ourselves. Could we do something more? Could we be like those soldiers of 1944? Can we storm the beaches in the hearts of you and me? Reclaim our nation's soul and restore our destiny. There's nothing stopping us but fear, but there's no fear that's real. It's the greatest generation's time